So your argument and the advocates of decriminalization say people are going to be taking this stuff anyway.
They are. And the problem is there's no checks and balances. So people that, let's say somebody wants to go and do ecstasy, like there was a famous case last year where 4 girls went, they passed the bar, they were excited. They
Young
went out,
lawyers?
just passed the bar, they went out, they all did ecstasy, one died because it had fentanyl in it. That's a tragedy. That shouldn't happen. Not in our society. We do have measures to be able to allow people to do what they're going to do safely.
The man you just heard from is an investor and entrepreneur who goes by the name Bill Panagiotakopoulos. Yes, that is his name. And he was speaking to Bloomberg about his plans to start a new business called basically Safe Supply. It's a company that's looking to cash in on the drug trade once now banned narcotics are legalized. And we should be concerned when you look into his business model and everything that he is investing in, because it's not just the idea of legalizing the drugs. He's also investing in things like rehabilitation centers once people become addicted to the drugs that he plans to push for. Now, Safe Supply, which has raised about $4 million in venture capital and went public last year, believes that the global surge in legalization policies will create a market worth hundreds of billions of dollars, one they plan to get in on at the ground level. I'm gonna pause right now and just say, remember, the idea of decriminalizing hard drugs and regulating them was meant to encourage people to get help for their addiction, as opposed to throwing them in prison, where honestly, I don't believe that people suffering from addiction belong. That was the idea. The drug war failed. How do we rethink our policies in order to help the people who need help and to stop criminalizing people who have really no business behind bars? That was the whole point. This guy sees it as, oh my God, this is an opportunity for me to push hard drugs on people, right? To see this as a business and to make money off of them, both in the process of pushing the drugs and selling the drugs, but also in the aftermath once people are addicted and need rehabilitative services. So he believes that widespread drug legalization is coming. I don't blame him for believing that, because we've already seen a little bit of it happen. And he believes that entrepreneurs should absolutely capitalize on it. And it's based on this global shift toward more liberal drug policies. The entire basis of this Canadian company's model is based on the legalization of cannabis, which I think is fine, psychedelics, and the pilot programs that have sprung up in various states in the US. So Safe Supply even cites this timeline on their website to argue for starting what they call the third and final wave of drug reform. Let's take a look. So they give this timeline starting with 2001, where Portugal decriminalized all drugs. Portugal's initial model was very effective, specifically because they maintained a stigma toward drug use and pushed people into getting rehabilitative services to beat their addiction. They later cut funding for these programs and basically did away with some of that stigma. And as a result, addiction to some drugs actually spiked in Portugal. They're now trying to revert back to their previous model. I did a lengthy deep dive video on that, which you should check out. But Portugal's initial model did work, and I'm in favor of that. But let's continue. They also provide the example of Oregon and Colorado in 2019. They decriminalized all drugs. Funny enough, they didn't mention that Oregon has changed course since then, which we'll get back to in just a moment. 2021, British Columbia applied to have all drugs decriminalized and is taking proactive measures, including the first prescribed safer supply program. There's more. 2022, experts around the world, including members of the UN and the entire country of Scotland, are calling for the drug war to come to an end. 2023, Bern, Switzerland announced intent to conduct a pilot of legal cocaine sales. By the way, speaking of cocaine, he seems to be hyper-focused on launching all of this, with cocaine being like the main drug that they're pushing out into communities. By the way, cocaine also very addictive from what I hear. Now, Oregon did roll back their decriminalization. I really want to get back to that in a minute because it's important to know about why that happened. But what's even more concerning about how he seems to be using the same profit-driven strategies is that he's using these profit-driven strategies that pharmaceutical companies used in the lead up to the opioid epidemic. Pharmaceutical companies knew that these painkillers were severely addictive. And so not only did they push these drugs into communities, they also were making money off rehabilitation services that were tasked with helping people get over their opioid addictions. So with that said, according to Safe Supply, they're planning to create a $360 billion plus total addressable market. And so Panagiotakopoulos insists that he's not trying to get anyone hooked on drugs, but believes prohibiting them is a waste of time and capital. He says that money is being made every single minute of the day on drugs, just the wrong people are making the money. He thinks he's the right person to make money off of pushing drugs into communities. And it's funny that he says that he's not trying to get anyone addicted to drugs. That's not what he's trying to do here. Except he and his backers are sizing up their investments in drug test strips, rehabilitation centers, laboratories, and other products that may experience a boom during a legalized drug market, which also includes selling the drug, which he intends to do.
A lot of mainstream media don't give you honest news. We do. You know why? Because of you. Paid membership on YouTube makes all the difference. Hit the join button below and you become the hero that sustains us.
Now, let's pivot back to what happened in Oregon, because Oregon did decriminalize drugs in their state, and it ended up being a complete and utter disaster, mostly because they claimed that they were following the successful Portugal model, but that is not what happened. They did not follow the successful Portugal model, and as a result, drug addiction and overdose deaths skyrocketed in their state. So the key elements of the measure, which was known as Measure 110, were the removal of criminal penalties for possession of small amounts of drugs, including methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. In turn, that created a sharper focus on reducing harm. At least that's what they were hoping would happen. That didn't happen though. More than $260 million were allocated to services such as naloxone distribution, employment and housing services, and voluntary treatment. Supporters hoped that ending penalties and reducing the associated stigma of drug use, that was the big problem, would bring a range of benefits. But it turns out, guys, that if you look at the Portugal model that worked, they kept the stigma of drug use. The idea that stigma is a bad thing in any and all cases, I believe is ridiculous. There is a reason why social norms exist. And if you do away with the stigma of this drug use, it becomes a normalized part of society. And I think that that did not bode well for states like Oregon, and that's why they've changed course. Once drugs were decriminalized and destigmatized, the thinking went, those who wanted to continue using would be more willing to access harm reduction services that help them use in safer ways. But that didn't happen. Measure 110 failed because those advocating for it misunderstood addiction and also misunderstood the need for stigmatizing the use of drugs like meth. The drug overdose death rate increased by 43% in 2021, its first year of implementation, and then kept rising. The latest CDC data show that in the 12 months ending in September of 2023, deaths by overdose grew by 41.6% versus 2.1% nationwide. No other state saw a higher rise in deaths. And look, I give the voters in Oregon a lot of credit for changing course, for trying a policy, seeing that the policy did not work and actually had all sorts of unintended consequences that were terrible for the state and for the people living in that state, they changed course. That's what you're supposed to do. You recalibrate once you realize that your favored policies are flawed. I wish people in LA maybe reconsidered some of the policies that we've implemented here, but they're slow to catch on. they keep re-electing terrible politicians who keep pushing terrible policies that seem to punish people who are trying to do the right thing in Los Angeles. But who knows, maybe they'll change course sooner rather than later. Now, drug users didn't seek help and would ignore the $100 drug possession tickets that replaced criminal penalties in Oregon. And again, to be clear, I don't think criminal penalties are really the right way to go. I think that you can implement the Portugal model in a way that works. It's just that they didn't do that in Oregon. But still, Panagiotakopoulos wants to ignore the failure of that system and basically add to it because he sees that there are profit-making opportunities here. That is the concern that I have. Once you have entrepreneurs and business interests get involved, you think they're not going to push for highly addictive drugs to be sold to people in various communities? You think they're not gonna do that? Clearly they're gonna do that. That's why this guy is investing in rehabilitation centers. All right, let's hear more of what he has to say.
We know that some jurisdictions such as Oregon and even BC have been having second thoughts about decriminalized drug use. In some cities, obviously, there's the spectacle of people openly using hard drugs.
So the best example is Portugal. Portugal decriminalized 20 years ago, and they saw a 1,000-fold decrease in overdoses, in the transmission of infectious diseases, HIV, and hepatitis. It was a success, but it's a half measure. Okay, if you want to go that route and decriminalize it, that's great. You got to then start offering a supply. It's a commodity. I mean, we could sit here and say it's illegal, and it is. But the reality is, for the last 50 years, you can go to any major city or any city really and buy cocaine.
It's a commodity, guys. These drugs are a commodity for this guy who plans on pushing them out into the world and profiting both off of the sale and the rehabilitation services that come after people are severely addicted to drugs like cocaine. It's a commodity, it's a commodity. This wasn't the point of decriminalizing drugs. And I love that he brings up the Portugal model when he has no intention of implementing a Portugal model at all. You think this guy wants to stigmatize the use of hard drugs like meth and cocaine? But the Daily Beast did talk to some drug experts, thankfully, regarding Safe Supply's model, and they believe that it's misguided, comparing the model to how the opioid crisis panned out. And they're right to do that because it's very similar to the opioid crisis. Keith Humphreys, a psychiatry and behavioral sciences professor at Stanford, also referenced the opioid crisis to point out the flaws in Safe Supply's model, saying, quote, "I think the Sackler family proved through Purdue Pharma that if you can dramatically increase the supply of addictive drugs, you can make an extraordinary sum of money." And he said this referring to the makers of the painkiller OxyContin. You have to addict and kill a lot of people in the process, but you do make a lot of money. And finally, he also says that drug legalization means corporations, marketing, lobbying, and all the things the tobacco industry does, and that dramatically increases use, which increases death and addiction. Portugal's model started to fail, specifically when the government decided to outsource what they were doing to nonprofits. Okay, essentially a public-private model. And basically the services, the rehabilitative services, helping people get over their addictions, that kind of fell by the wayside. In this case, we're not even talking about a government being involved in helping people beat an addiction. We're talking about a private company that is seeking to make money, openly admitting that they are seeking to make money off of the sale of highly addictive drugs. And so I share this story with you not to say that we should be super hard on people who are addicted to drugs. No, I share this story with you to say, you have to be savvy enough to understand that when it comes to certain progressive policies, there are moneyed interests who see an opportunity to co-opt those policies for their own financial benefit. And they have a role in swaying how those policies are implemented, how they're written. And if you are on the left, and anyone who pushes back against progressive policies because they want to make sure that it's precise, if you have a negative reaction to that, please just reconsider, because there are people who want the same thing you want, but are a little more cautious in how these policies get implemented. And so we'll see how this plays out, but I really, really hope that rather than go in the Oregon state model, we actually realize that those models failed and we really implement the Portugal model instead. We'll see. I doubt it. We seem to screw up every policy that we've implemented, including a lot of criminal justice reform policies that could have been great, but ended up going way too far and reclassifying all sorts of severe violent crimes like strangulation and child sex trafficking as nonviolent crimes that are ineligible for bail. Absolute ridiculousness, but here we are.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.